What is Godzilla? To many, Godzilla may simply be a man in a monster suit storming through a miniature version of Japan, or maybe the monster that headlined a massive cinematic universe and established itself as the king of the monsters. What many people don't know is the creature's history and significance to the culture surrounding it. Throughout the years, Godzilla has evolved to symbolize many different concepts and ideas. So we'll be discussing Godzilla's origins, from a metaphorical hydrogen bomb to its rise as the king of the monsters, and end with the current day as a criticism of Japan's government. So let's start with the film that began it all. The original Toho film directed by Ishiro Honda, Gojira. Godzilla's history began in 1945 with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, easily one of the most catastrophic events to ever face Japan. The first bomb wiped out approximately 90% of the city of Hiroshima and killed an estimated 80,000 people immediately on impact. The second bomb in Nagasaki would go on to kill an estimated 40,000 people, and would lead to a Japanese surrender in World War II due to the power of a new and most cruel bomb. However, many of the people of Japan would not know the true horrors and devastation the bombs created because of the censorship brought upon the country by the United States after their surrender in 1945. The forces occupying Japan at the time were more concerned with censoring anything involving the atomic bombs. In an interview with the Criterion Collection, Japanese film critic Taro Sato would go on to say, things like factual reports about Hiroshima and Nagasaki were very strictly censored. Only sentimental treatments of the subject were allowed, such as Eternal Song of Nagasaki and The Bells of Nagasaki. It wasn't until 7 years later, 1952, and the Japanese were finally able to approach the tragedy and showcase it and its horrors on the big screen. The first film to feature the events was a docudrama, directed by Kaneto Shindo, by the name of Children of Hiroshima. The film was released only a few months after the occupation's end, and detailed the effects of radiation exposure and the people of Hiroshima that had to suffer through it. The film would be followed by another simply titled Hiroshima. This film was funded by the Japanese Teachers Union in an attempt to show a more harsh, more detailed, and more realistic version of the bombing. Toho Studios was looking to make a film called In the Shadow of Glory, with their newly found freedom of expression. The film was to be both a Japanese and Indonesian production on the Japanese occupation of Indonesia. Producer Tomoyuki Tanaka was tasked with flying over to Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, after the country denied Japanese filmmakers visas because of the anti-Japanese sentiment. Unsuccessful with his attempt, Tanaka got back on a flight to Japan, and on his flight, the producer was looking out into the Pacific and recalled of the incident in Bikini Atoll. This site would then become an idea that we would soon come to recognize as Gojira. In 1954, a Japanese tuna fishing boat by the name of the Lucky Dragon No. 5 was set with the task of fishing at Midway Atoll. However, the boat would end up near the Marshall Islands, where, unbeknownst to the crew, the United States would test a hydrogen bomb on Bikini Atoll the very same day. The boat would feel the radioactive effects of the bomb, and be covered in a thick ash the crew labeled as Shinohai, or death ash. The ash brought along with it illness and pain to the crew that were hospitalized upon arrival back in Japan. The entire crew would sustain injuries that would live on with them for the rest of their lives as a reminder of the event that occurred on that day. All but one crew member, the radio operator by the name of Akichi Kuboyama, that would unfortunately succumb to his injuries and pass away only a few months after the incident. This event would later become a major political issue in Japan, which felt that they had been attacked by the United States for a third time. This birthed the popular anti-nuclear movement in Japan that would lead to the United States paying Japan for reparations because of the damage they had done. Tomoyuki Tanaka would take this event and eventually shape it into the film audiences have grown to adore by the name of Gojira. Before becoming the iconic monster everyone knows today, the creature took on many different looks, most notably that of a combination of a gorilla and a whale. This combination of the Japanese names for the animals birthed the name Gojira. However, the creature would be changed to have a more dinosaur-esque look. Its original dinosaur design was meant to be used for stop motion, much like one of the film's inspirations, King Kong. However, the design would once again change to finally resemble the iconic design we all know and love today. Many elements of the design were meant to resemble the event that occurred on Bikini Atoll earlier that year, particularly the creature's head, which had been designed to appear as a mushroom cloud in certain shots. Another example being the scales on the creature's body, which were meant to resemble the burnt skin of the crew members aboard the Lucky Dragon. The creature was as the physical manifestation of the atomic bombings and the effect it had on the people of Japan. It represented the evils of mankind and the destruction left behind by its footprint. Godzilla wasn't meant to be shown as an antagonist to humanity, but rather a byproduct of humanity's belligerence. This is why the creature mimics the destruction brought upon the bombings in Japan. In the film, Godzilla's presence brings radioactivity with it. This not only harms the people, but also specifically the tuna in the film. After the bombing at Bikini Atoll, Japan was left with a shortage of tuna because of the damage done to the wildlife around the area due to the radiation. However, the scenes of scorched fields and a burning Tokyo are what resonated with Japanese audiences the most. The all too familiar scorched fields and the blazing buildings were things that many of the Japanese had witnessed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They knew the metaphors being told with this massive, destructive, merciless force that could not be stopped and people lived in fear of. The monster resembles all the hardships of Japan during and after World War II, and is a reminder of the consequences of humanity's actions. By the film's end, humanity is the antagonist. As much destruction as Godzilla brought in the film, it's never a question of if the creature's gonna die, but when. When the creature is faced with humanity, it is clear which will prevail. It's no surprise that when the creature is surrounded by humans, it meets its downfall. The film was a massive box office success in Japan, making an estimated 125 million yen, or approximately $2,250,000, off of a budget of 62 million yen, or approximately $175,000. This success would later lead to attention from around the world, specifically the United States. In 1956, the rights to Gojira would be handed to American film producer Joseph E. Levine. Levine would go on to rename the film into Godzilla, King of the Monsters, as well as re-edit and dub Honda's original vision.
Everyone who had survived without serious injury was helping to repair the human wreckage. One of the survivors was Emiko Yamane, the daughter of Japan's famous paleontologist. For some of the victims, there was hope. For others, there would be no tomorrow.
The re-edited version of the film would only contain 40 minutes of the original film, meaning that out of the original runtime of 98 minutes, 60% of it was cut out. Specifically, references to Nagasaki, contaminated food such as the tuna, and bomb shelters were all cut. It appeared that the United States once again was censoring the truth of the damage done and the devastation brought upon the people of Japan by the ruinous bombs. With the re-edits came along the addition of popular American actor Raymond Burr to give an American perspective to a strictly Japanese experience. In the film, Burr is reporting on the events of Godzilla as they occur, with poorly edited scenes of him falsely interacting with the characters spliced in. Unsurprisingly, the film was a disaster and was critically panned. The film was no longer about the metaphorical horrors of the hydrogen bombs, but rather a popcorn flick that marketed on the fact that there was a giant monster terrorizing humanity.
Godzilla, King of the Monsters, incredible titan of terror, a story to stun the mind as a gargantuan creature of the sea surges up on a tidal wave of destruction to wreak vengeance on the earth. Godzilla, King of the Monsters, fantastic beyond comprehension, tripping beyond compare, astounding beyond belief, the mightiest monster of them all. See Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
There is only one mention of the hydrogen bombs, and it was to explain why Godzilla was on a rampage. The original film would not receive an official Western release until May of 2004, when it received a limited theatrical release through Rialto Pictures. The film would later receive a DVD release through Classic Media in 2006, making it readily available for the Western world to watch for the first time in roughly 52 years. A few years later, in 2012, the film would be digitally restored by the Criterion Collection, leaving the film remastered and leaving the United States with Ishiro Honda's original vision. With the massive success of the original Gojira in Japan, Toho Studios began production on another Godzilla film titled Godzilla Raids Again. This film would feature the second kaiju introduced into the series, Anguirus. Keeping with the dinosaur design of the kaiju, the creature resembled an Ankylosaurus. In the film, the two kaiju are rivals and fight until the creatures end up in Osaka, where Godzilla kills Anguirus with its atomic breath. The film ends with Godzilla being buried by an avalanche, created by missiles shot into a mountain by the hero of the film. Beginning with this film, Godzilla would quickly move away from the symbolic nature of its creation and instead dive into a period of action, known to many as the Showa Period. 7 years after Godzilla raids again, Godzilla returned to the big screen against one of its biggest inspirations, King Kong. Returning to direct the film would be Ishiro Honda, who would go on to direct several of the sequels in the Showa period. This film would mark the first time Godzilla would be shown in color, as well as the first in many Versus films. The original concept for the film was King Kong meets Frankenstein. After several changes due to issues with the rights to Frankenstein's monster, and other issues with stop animation, Frankenstein's monster was dropped and substituted with Godzilla. However, certain aspects of the monster stayed within the film, such as his ability to gain strength through electricity. These tropes were given to King Kong due to bad script changes even though the monster was swapped out for Godzilla. Since Godzilla was still viewed as an antagonist at the time, and King Kong was considered as more popular in Japan, Toho officially gave King Kong the win in the film. This film would mark the beginning of Godzilla's slow transition into a more child-friendly product, evolving it to slowly become more of a protagonist. Although King Kong would not return for any more Godzilla sequels, it was featured in another Toho-produced film called King Kong Escapes, where Kong faces a robot version of itself. The film was made in 1967 and was directed by none other than Ishiro Honda. As for Frankenstein's monster, it would also be featured in a Toho-produced movie called Frankenstein vs. Baragon. The film featured a Japanese reimagining of the Frankenstein's monster that was simply titled Frankenstein, and is created by a scientist in Nazi Germany. Baragon would not make an appearance in another Toho film until Destroy All Monsters in 1968, implying that Frankenstein does indeed exist in the world of Godzilla. Frankenstein vs. Baragon would receive a loose sequel in the form of War of the Gargantuas in 1966. Both films were also directed by Ishiro Honda. Following its matchup with King Kong, Godzilla would go on to face another kaiju that was created during its slumber of 7 years after Godzilla raids again, Mothra. The film was both a sequel to King Kong vs. Godzilla and Mothra's debut film, Mothra. The film would take a fairly unconventional approach to the existing Godzilla films by introducing characters, specifically Mothra's fairies, that changed the pace and the attitude of the typical Godzilla film. The film once again uses Godzilla as the antagonist and Mothra as a protagonist, specifically a defender of Japan. By the end of the film, Godzilla defeats Mothra, but not before having laid 2 eggs that spawn 2 larvae that also face off against Godzilla and are victorious. The following film introduces Ghidorah, otherwise known as Ghidorah, in the film Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. This film marks an important point in the Showa period for multiple different reasons. Firstly, much like Mothra vs. Godzilla before it, it introduced a creature created during Godzilla's downtime into the world of Godzilla. This creature would be the iconic Rodan. Secondly, it introduced one of the all-time fan favorites into the series, Ghidorah, which would become the main adversary against Godzilla. And third, this film marks the first time Godzilla is truly used as a protagonist and would continue to do so for the rest of the Showa period. This film features a fight with Godzilla and Rodan which eventually turns into Ghidorah against Godzilla, Rodan, and Mothra still in its larval form. The series then continued on with other films featuring many of the same kaiju. Invasion of the Astro Monster would have an alien race take control of Ghidorah and put it up against Godzilla and Rodan. Ibra, Horror of the Deep, would have Godzilla take the part of King Kong, who was supposed to have the main role, and make it face Ibra, a giant lobster kaiju. And then came Son of Godzilla, which introduced Godzilla's son, dubbed Manila. This is where Godzilla's turn into a more child-friendly monster really started to accelerate. With Godzilla now being marketed towards children, the films from this point on heavily added comedic or quirky scenes that the original vision for Godzilla would have never done, showing just how far this monster had come in the span of 8 films. In 1968, the 9th and the apparent final Godzilla film was released. Destroy All Monsters featured several kaiju from the previous films to battle once more for a final epic fight. The film takes place in the future where all of the monsters have been collected and put onto an island called Monsterland. Due to some aliens, chaos ensues, and then the film concludes with a battle of the Monsterland monsters against Ghidorah. It was at this point that the series was meant to end because of the significant decline in ticket sales, as well as producer Tomoyuki Tanaka stating that all the ideas had run out. However, only a year after Destroy All Monsters' release, All Monsters Attack was released to the public. This was the point where the Godzilla films started to become specifically geared towards children. This film featured an unconventional plot, where a child has to overcome bullies as well as some bank robbers later in the film. He does this by fantasizing about befriending Manila on the newly dubbed Monster Island. Manila can change size and speak to the child in this film. The child gets empowered after watching Manila deal with his own bully on Monster Island, and thus confronts the bullies in real life and is victorious. The obvious message here being,
Godzilla says that I should learn to fight my own battles, you know.
Not to take drugs. The following film, Godzilla vs. Hedorah, has Godzilla face off against a monster that is made out of the world's pollution. This film features many messages about saving the planet while showing imagery such as garbage in water accompanied by a song titled Save the Earth. But despite its message of pollution, probably the main takeaway from the film came from how Godzilla decided to chase Hedorah after it started flying away. This scene has easily become one of the most iconic scenes in Godzilla's history due to it simply being one of the most ludicrous scenes in Godzilla's history. But this was just the beginning of the hilarity. Godzilla vs. Gigan was not a very significant entry into the series other than to present another popular reoccurring enemy in the form of Gigan. However, the film would mark the final time Godzilla would be played by actor Haruo Nakajima, thus making it as if the monster had lost the final piece of what made Godzilla what it was. Aside from that, the film itself seemed to have been plagued by a lazy production. There were many shots taken from other films, specifically Destroy All Monsters, and much of the soundtrack was recycled from prior Toho films, such as the previously mentioned Frankenstein Conquers the World and King Kong Escapes. For the next kaiju installment, Toho wanted to have a superhero like that of Ultraman face off against a new kaiju by the name of Megalon. So they held a contest where an elementary school student's design for the new superhero would win. The hero would eventually be titled Jet Jaguar. However, after some screen testings, it was decided that the film could not be carried by Jet Jaguar alone. It was settled that the addition of both Godzilla and Gigan would be put into the film. The film, titled Godzilla vs. Megalon, was filmed in a very short 3 weeks, and because of that, reuses many clips from Godzilla vs. Gigan to compensate. However, this film features a scene that compensates for it all. Despite this, the film was critically panned for its lazy and sloppy filmmaking, particularly the special effects, which were clearly low effort to many. The next film, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, would be a return to earlier works in the franchise for its 20th anniversary. The film begins reminiscently to that of the original Godzilla film, with the king of the monsters attacking humanity once again. However, this creature would actually turn out to be Mechagodzilla, a robotic being created by ape-like aliens. The 15th and final film in the Showa period would be a direct sequel called Terror of Mechagodzilla, and it would also be the last time Ishiro Honda, the director of the original film and many after, would direct a Godzilla film. The film would feature the return of Mechagodzilla, alongside a new creature called Titanosaurus. In the film, Godzilla must face off against both, without any aid like it received in the prior installment. Godzilla is victorious and the film ends with Godzilla heading back into the sea. A fitting ending, as Godzilla would not return to the big screen for nearly a decade. The Heisei period would begin in 1984 with the return of Godzilla, also simply known as Godzilla in Japan. The film ignores the events of all the Showa period except for the original, which this film is a sequel to. And now with Godzilla's history as a defender of the Earth behind it, it once again returns to its origin as a ruthless monster set out on destruction. After the failure of the prior installment, specifically Terror of Mechagodzilla, Toho decided to return to the drawing board with the monster. After many ideas of what exciting fights Godzilla could have, it was eventually decided that Godzilla would return to its original purpose as a metaphor for the atomic bomb and nuclear radiation. This metaphor was even kept in the American version because of Raymond Burr, who played Steve Martin in Godzilla King of the Monsters. He expressed his feelings of the metaphor for Godzilla needing to be taken seriously. The original script involved Godzilla to instead be a metaphor for the 3 Mile Island accident that occurred during the 25th anniversary of Godzilla in 1979. This incident was caused by a nuclear meltdown that occurred in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. However, for unknown reasons, the script was rejected. A few years later, in 1983, American director Steve Miner proposed to make a Godzilla film to Toho. Toho accepted. However, the film was rejected by American movie studios due to the high cost of wanting to shoot the movie in stop motion as well as in 3D. Because of this, the film was never made, and it was probably for the best. However, before production for Miner's film ended, production for a strictly Japanese Godzilla began. This project would evolve into the film we all know today, The Return of Godzilla. The original plan was for Ishiro Honda to return to direct what would become the sequel to his masterpiece, Gojira. Honda declined as he was working with legendary filmmaker Akira Kurosawa on his films Kagemusha and Ran. Honda would also go on to remark that he believed the series should have ended after the death of Eiji Tsuburaya, the original special effects director. The production would continue to be troubled as the composer Akira Ifukube, who had been composing for the Godzilla franchise since the original, also declined to join because of Godzilla's decline in quality and increase in height. Instead of being 50 meters tall, as Godzilla had usually been, its height was now being increased to 80 meters. This was so Godzilla would appear taller in light of the skyscraper-filled Tokyo. Terayoshi Nakano, the special effects director for the film, urged for Godzilla to have a design of sadness, so that this Godzilla was not associated with the Godzilla marketed towards children, but one regarded as terrifying by audiences just as the original design had done. This film featured the first time where animatronics would be used in a Godzilla film. It was specifically used for close-ups of Godzilla's head, where it would do things such as tilt its head or move its lips, where wires would have been needed prior. The plot is fairly simple, featuring a new, more menacing Godzilla that terrorizes Tokyo once more. One notable difference is the inclusion of American and Russian tension from the Cold War. For example, amidst Godzilla's second attack on Tokyo, it destroys a Russian submarine. Russia assumes it was the Americans that destroyed the submarine and threatens nuclear war. The film was successful, however, gave little in terms of revenue to Toho, and left a sequel for the film up in the air. Because of this, producer Tomoyuki Tanaka suggested that Godzilla return from a force of nature to simply fighting monsters once again. Tanaka created another contest in which people could submit their story ideas for a sequel. The winner would be dentist Shinichiro Kobayashi, who wrote a script that dropped the focus of nuclear weapons and instead went into a direction of biotechnology. A few years later, and Godzilla vs. Biollante was created. Considering the aid of Kobayashi, the film took a very different approach to the typical Godzilla film. Firstly, the film featured a more spy-esque feel to it. This is because Kobayashi was more interested in James Bond films than he was Godzilla films. The antagonist was also unconventional in the fact that he was created using Godzilla's DNA. Not to mention the film also featured a fair amount of imagery, particularly with the dead daughter of the scientist in the film. The film did significantly less well than its predecessor despite its positive reviews for its fresh, unconventional filmmaking that was unseen in a Godzilla film. Because of this, it was decided that an enemy from Godzilla's past in the Showa period would return to face off against Godzilla once more. The selected monster was none other than Godzilla's arch-rival, King Ghidorah. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah would be the first film to feature Godzilla's past and its evolution into the Godzilla of this timeline. Godzilla originated as a dinosaur that was mutated by radiation exposure from the atomic bomb in World War II, and became the king of the monsters through it. However, the film did not come without its fair share of controversy. This is because many people found the portrayal of World War II in the film to be of fairly poor taste and damaging damaging to American-Japanese relationships. It was also notable that none of the Godzilla films past this point received US releases until the rise in popularity of the DVD medium. Despite this, the film was considered a success, and because of it, Toho decided it would be a good idea to bring back another monster from Godzilla's past for it to fight once again. For the fourth installment in the Heisei period, Toho decided to bring back one of the most beloved kaiju of the series, Mothra. The original plan was for Mothra to return in its own film against a creature named Bagon. The film was changed to include Godzilla as it was more recognized outside of Japan, and Toho didn't believe a standalone Mothra film would do well internationally. Because of this, in 1992, Godzilla vs. Mothra was released. The film took many ideas from the original standalone Mothra script and took the antagonist of the film and reworked it from Bagon to Batra, a menacing version of Mothra. The film was a massive success and became the highest grossing film of the Heisei period, and if adjusted for inflation, the entire franchise. This is also the last Godzilla film made before the death of Ishiro Honda, who had been heavily criticizing the returning series. It was reported that he visited the set for the film shortly before passing. Toho proposed to end the series once more in honor of the passing of Ishiro Honda, as well as to avoid competition with the American Godzilla film that was in production at that time. The original plan was for a remake of one of the most successful installments in the series, Godzilla vs. King Kong. However, gaining the rights to King Kong proved to be costly, and all other ideas involving King Kong were scrapped. Since Toho saw the success in the returning monsters from the Showa period battling against Godzilla once more, it was decided that the returning monster would be Mechagodzilla, to fight again in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. Not only that, but it would feature the returns of Godzilla's son and Rodan. The film was heavily promoted with the returning monsters, the children's program called Godzilla Land, and noting the film as Akira Ifukube's final performance as a composer, even though this would not be the case. It was planned for Godzilla to be killed off at the end of the film. However, the ending was saved as another installment would be made using this ending as a way to promote the film. The film was yet another success and planted the seeds for the final installment of the Heisei period. Before the final installment would come, another film named Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla was released. The film calls back to the second in the Heisei series, Godzilla vs. Biollante. This is because it is stated that Biollante's DNA, which has a mixture of Godzilla's DNA, was brought into outer space by Mothra and is morphed from radiation in a black hole to create Space Godzilla. Convoluted creation story aside, the film was also a success. The film aimed to branch out into other mediums, specifically TV, with the introduction of a more child-friendly design for Godzilla's son, instead of the dinosaur-esque look given to it in the prior installment. It was a children's show titled Little Godzilla's Underground Adventure. However, this never came to be. Even though this installment and the prior were considered successful, they were both critically mixed and showed lower numbers compared to that of the extremely successful Godzilla vs. Mothra. Because of this, Toho decided it was finally time to put Godzilla to rest. In 1995, Toho announced to the world that Godzilla would officially die in the next feature. The announcement of Godzilla's upcoming death made global news, as many people around the world were saddened by the end of the monster's 42-year reign as the king of the monsters.
But in his 22nd film, Godzilla vs. the Destroyer, to be released December 9th in Japan, the 42-year-old monster will finally meet his end. Godzilla will die.
It reached a point where a Godzilla statue was being constructed at Hibaya, where several people mourned after the film's release. The original plan for the film involved the spirit of the 1954 Godzilla possessing Godzilla's son, Godzilla Jr. While this idea was scrapped, it was considered fitting that the original film take precedence in the final film. Through this, Godzilla once again regained its metaphorical implications in Godzilla vs. Destroyer. In this film, Godzilla's past would come back to haunt it in the form of 3 other creatures evolved from the death of the original Godzilla through the Oxygen Destroyer. Godzilla in this film is a literal ticking time bomb. It is stated in the film that Godzilla's heart acts like a nuclear reactor and is going through a meltdown. So now, it's not only a metaphor for the atomic bombs, but a physical manifestation of it. The film begins with Godzilla not attacking Tokyo, but rather Hong Kong. This is where it is discovered that Godzilla is strangely glowing red as it attacks. Then the facts about Godzilla's heart are uncovered, and it is discovered that should Godzilla explode, it could potentially destroy the world with it. By the end of the film, Godzilla faces Destoroyah after it killed Godzilla Jr. Godzilla is unsuccessful in doing so, and the military actually manages to defeat the foe. Godzilla then starts to melt down and die. However, the military in the film is able to freeze Godzilla enough to the point where the damage is minimal. The radiation is still enough to render Tokyo completely uninhabitable, just like the original Godzilla's presence did. But the radiation goes away as Godzilla Jr. comes back to life, as a fully grown Godzilla. This suggested that the monster would embark on its own series, but this would not happen, and fans of the series would have to wait 4 years for the king to return to the big screen in Japan once again. Before Godzilla would make its comeback in Japan, an American Godzilla film would make an appearance. Henry G. Saperstein, a producer that worked on distributing Godzilla films to the US, received permission from Toho to pitch an American Godzilla film, who then pitched the idea to Sony producers, Kerry Woods and Robert Fried. They proposed the idea of an American Godzilla film to Columbia Pictures and were rejected. The idea was then proposed to TriStar, which originally rejected it, but would later be accepted after meeting with the CEO of Sony Pictures Entertainment, Peter Guber. TriStar Vice Chairman Ken Lemberger was sent out to Tokyo and received the rights to the monster from Toho in 1992. The same year, Godzilla vs. Mothra was released in Japan. The same year, TriStar announced that it would be making a trilogy of Godzilla films that would stay true to the original Japanese films, specifically retaining the anti-nuclear theme that the American version of the Godzilla films up to that point had made an effort to avoid. Many of the people behind the Japanese Godzilla films were excited to see what the United States could do with the property, expressing their high expectations for the film. Even Ishiro Honda, before his passing, would state that he was excited for the project, as he was still very upset with the direction the Heisei Period Godzilla films had been taking. Before pre-production for the film began, many different scripts were created for the American version of the monster. One version of the script involved Godzilla being created from Atlanteans, rather than being mutated from the atomic bomb, and would have Godzilla face off against an alien kaiju with the ability to shapeshift called the Griffin. Clear similarities to Gamera's Heisei Origins aside, the script seemed to be the one TriStar would choose to begin production with. This was until Jan de Bont, the person who wrote the script, requested TriStar for a budget of $100 to $120 million. He was denied, even though the final product would end up having a budget of $125 million. TriStar later found a director for the film by the name of Roland Emmerich. He and producer Dean Devlin signed on to make the film before the release of their latest film, Independence Day. Emmerich signed on to the project only asking that he have absolute creative control over the project, as he wanted to discard much of Godzilla's history, alter its appearance, and change many of its signature features. He believed the design Toho made for Godzilla didn't make any sense, and decided that he didn't want it to look like a monster, but rather make it into an animal. Emmerich would go on to state, "I didn't want to make the original Godzilla. I wanted nothing to do with it. I wanted to make my own." With this in mind, he gave it the ability to run and altered its design to resemble more of an iguana. This is probably because Emmerich would change Godzilla's origin as a dinosaur that is exposed to radiation to an iguana that was exposed to radiation from nuclear testing. The nuclear origin being the only part of Godzilla's origin that stayed, because that was all of Godzilla's origin he wanted to use. With their script ready, the film went into pre-production where it was confirmed that Godzilla was going to be made with CGI, despite having made an animatronic Godzilla suit. The film was heavily marketed in the United States, with a teaser trailer showing the foot of Godzilla crushing the skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus Rex in a museum. Most likely a nod at one of the 1998 film's direct influences, Jurassic Park. Taco Bell would also help in the marketing of the film by creating an ad featuring the new Godzilla, ironically with the roar of the T-Rex in Jurassic Park.
I think I need a bigger box.
The film was released on May 20th of 1998 and was universally panned. There were several reasons why the movie was hated, but one of the most notable reasons is its resemblance to the Lost World Jurassic Park. The new Godzilla's appearance and motions were all strikingly similar to that of the T-Rex in the Lost World. Godzilla also lays some eggs in the film that once hatched baby Godzilla creatures attack in a manner very similarly to the velociraptors of the original Jurassic Park. It was clear where the influences had come from, and fans were more eager to see the famous Japanese monster that they had grown to love rather than the abomination of a creature audiences witnessed. Not only was the beloved monster mishandled, but the general filmmaking was also stilted and noticeably rushed. This was because TriStar rushed Emmerich into making the film ready for Memorial Day weekend, to ironically compete with the box office success of The Lost World Jurassic Park. Emmerich would later go on to state that he regretted being a part of the film's production, but also that he thought the film was better than the critics were making it out to be. He would also go on to state that he never took the movie seriously, and that he was never a big Godzilla fan. Producer Dean Devlin took the issue much more seriously and much less like a sore loser. He stated how he thought many decisions made for the film were big mistakes, and that he took full responsibility for the poor writing of the film. Even the original Japanese filmmakers were so disappointed with the product that they bought the rights to the new Godzilla, changed its name from Godzilla to simply Zilla, and killed the abomination off in 2004's Godzilla Final Wars in a very quick, simple manner. Regardless, the film was a box office success, but TriStar decided against continuing the plan of a trilogy after its critical reception, despite the ending leaving the possibility for a sequel. Instead, the Japanese Godzilla would soon be making its return. With a distaste for the new American Godzilla, and the fans of the Toho Godzilla wanting the monster to return from the dead after its death in 1995, Toho decided to start production on a new Godzilla film named Godzilla 2000 Millennium. Only 2 months after the release of the TriStar version, Godzilla would once again be renovated, however to a much lesser degree than before. Godzilla would return to an atomic origin, but the anti-nuclear theme would be much less prevalent in this film. Its appearance was changed once more, and its height scaled down. It is presumed that the film once again rebooted the series, meaning that it ignored all the films but the original. The film seemed to have taken a few elements from the TriStar version, by implementing CGI versions of the monster into the film, as well as many green screen shots. The film was released in the United States in theaters, and caused a lot of confusion for audience members that assumed it was a sequel to the TriStar film. Despite this, the film did well in the box office, but it was decided that Godzilla would once again return to direct-to-DVD in the United States. The next film in the series, Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, was also considered a reboot to the franchise. The same filmmaking of CGI and green screen effects were in the film, and the narrative of the film was still fairly weak. The film did significantly less well than the film that came before it, and it was met with a significantly mixed to negative reception, as critics were getting tired of the formula Godzilla films had run into. Even the antagonist of the film had its origins in 1956's Rodan, and then gained shades of Biollante, as it was a monster created with the aid of Godzilla's DNA. With the reception the film received, and the simple monster versus monster formula becoming old to audiences, Toho once again decided to reboot the franchise with Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, giant monsters all-out attack. The film would once again give Godzilla a new look that was much more similar to that of the original design. Its origins were also slightly augmented, as it still had its atomic beginnings, but now is also an apparent manifestation of those killed by the Japanese army in the Pacific War, focusing on trying to present more of an anti-war angle rather than an anti-nuclear one. The other monsters in the film would also receive updated designs, as Godzilla would now be the feature antagonist, rather than King Ghidorah as it had usually been. These designs would leave Ghidorah, Mothra, and Baragon smaller, weaker, and left without some of their signature abilities. The updated Godzilla design was to make it look stronger, as all 3 monsters would face off against it. Godzilla would eventually defeat all 3 monsters, but would go on to be defeated by the spirits of the 3 defeated monsters, as well as the main character's father, being completely disintegrated aside from its still beating heart, promising yet another return. With all the star power featured in the film, it was no surprise that it was successful. But even with the success of the film, Toho once more decided to reboot the series with Godzilla against Mechagodzilla. This would be the 3rd time Godzilla would face its robotic adversary. However, this time it would come with a twist. Considering the film was once again a reboot, it took the original Godzilla and put it up against the new one. This was done by taking the skeleton of the original Godzilla and making them the foundation for Mechagodzilla. While the narrative may have been nonsensical, the film also did very well, and would be followed up with a direct sequel, rather than restarting the series once again. The fifth film in the Millennium Period would be Tokyo SOS, which essentially features the same battle, but with the addition of Mothra, who is angered by the use of Godzilla's bones explained in the previous film. The film ends with the death of Mothra, but with the hatching of two new larvae, just like their original meetup in Mothra vs. Godzilla. Mechagodzilla also drags itself and Godzilla to the bottom of the ocean. The film didn't have much to it, but it was still successful, and paved the way for the final installment of the Millennium Period with its chaotic nature. After 28 total Godzilla films to this point, and 50 years of Godzilla, Toho decided that the 29th installment of the franchise was going to be the biggest feature yet, Godzilla Final Wars. This film brought back several different monsters, specifically from the Showa period, such as the likes of Rodan, Anguirus, King Caesar, Kamacuras, Kumanga, Ibra, Gigan, Hedorah, and even Manila, Godzilla's son, made a return in the film. It was an all-out rumble, where Godzilla single-handedly beat several monsters from its past once more for one last hurrah. The final fight would put Godzilla against its nemesis, King Ghidorah, once more, where Godzilla would prevail and once again return to rest with its son in the ocean. The film is the most expensive in the Toho series to date, costing nearly $20 million in US dollars. Disappointingly, the film underperformed and was the lowest grossing film of the Millennium Period, as well as the least attended since Terror of Mechagodzilla. The film did well critically and even led to Godzilla receiving a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. After this film, Godzilla would be allowed to rest for another decade before it would be revived once again. With Toho's Godzilla resting for 10 years, waiting for a resurgence, and TriStar's rights to the monster having expired in 2003, Legendary Pictures decided it was time to revive the American Godzilla. The original plan in 2004 was for the director of Godzilla vs. Hedorah, Yoshimitsu Banno, to direct a 40-minute short sequel for Godzilla vs. Hedorah in IMAX and 3D. The team behind the short would go out to Toho in Tokyo, where they negotiated their license to be able to create the film. However, Kerner Optical, a visual effects company signed to assist in the production of the film, was facing financial trouble which could have resulted in the cancellation of the project. In search of assistance, then proposed director Keith Melton met with Legendary Pictures in 2008. In 2010, it was confirmed that Legendary Pictures had acquired the rights to Godzilla from Toho, keeping only Yoshimitsu Banno, Kenji Okuhira, and Brian Rogers. Banno and Okuhira as executive producers, and Rogers as a producer. Banno would go on to state that while the film would no longer be a sequel to his Godzilla film, he still wanted and planned to make it in the future. With production of the film now known to the public, Legendary was quick to state that the monster would retain its original history, and not resemble the iguana-like creature of the 1998 American Godzilla film. It was rumored that Guillermo del Toro, director of films such as The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth, would be directing the film. Del Toro later denied the rumor, and it was soon discovered that Gareth Edwards, director of only one feature film prior, would be taking the director's seat. Many writers were assigned the task of working on Godzilla, most notably David Callahan, who worked on the original script, and Frank Darabont, who worked on a final rewrite for the film. Darabont wanted to return Godzilla to once again be a force of nature, and change the atomic theme of the film. Instead of being mutated by the atomic bomb in the film, the military is trying to kill the monster with an atomic bomb. Therefore, Godzilla became a manifestation of the wrath of nature, a creature dealing out punishment to humanity for the harm done to the world. However, Godzilla was left scripted as an anti-hero, as the introduction of two other monsters would take the role of antagonist, and humanity, specifically a character played by the lead actor, Aaron Taylor Johnson, would play the protagonist. The tone for the film was set to have a similar feeling to that of Steven Spielberg's Jaws, specifically by avoiding the appearance of Godzilla to build up anticipation. Another Spielberg film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, would also prove to be a massive influence on the film. Once again, Godzilla would be made from CGI. However, it would be much more well executed this time around. With the lack of the monster's appearance up until the end, and having scenes shot at night, Godzilla felt as if it had a physical presence in the world of the film. film, unlike the 1998 version. Before the film was released in 2014, Toho received an early screening of the film, who praised it and gave it a positive review. The film was released on May 16th of 2014 and opened to positive reviews and box office success. Many of the critics that went in to see the film stated how Godzilla had remained true to his Japanese origins, but had also become a monster of its own in the United States. The success of the film led to the creation of the 2017 film Kong Skull Island. The purpose of the film being to set up King Kong once more for a rematch of Godzilla and King Kong's classic bout in 1962. There is also a sequel for the 2014 Godzilla currently in production, and scheduled for release in 2019, currently titled Godzilla King of the Monsters. It is speculated that the iconic monsters of the Showa period, particularly Mothra, Rodan, and King Ghidorah, will also have prominent roles in the film. These films are all part of Legendary's Monsterverse, rebuilding the cinematic universe of Godzilla and other monsters. Should the films continue to be successful, it is likely that Godzilla will receive more films in the future, as well as formally introduce certain monsters like Mothra and Rodan in their own standalone films. It is also possible that longtime box office rival Gamera could eventually make its way into the Monsterverse, and give fans a long-awaited showdown between the two. However, this is all speculation, and during this downtime for the American Godzilla, the Toho Godzilla would once again be revitalized, and make its comeback once more. In December of 2014, after the success of Legendary's Godzilla, and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, as well as the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami still fresh in Japan's mind, Toho decided to let the beloved monster come out of its slumber after a decade of sleep. It was announced that production would soon start, and the film would have no relation to Legendary's Monsterverse. It was announced that the director of the acclaimed Neon Genesis Evangelion anime series, Hideki Anno, as well as Shinji Higuchi, would be co-directing the new film. Anno would also be working on the screenplay for the film, while Higuchi would work as the special effects director. Initially, Anno declined to work on the film in 2013 after having made Evangelion 3.0, You Cannot Redo, and falling into another depression. Later on in 2015, it was announced that the film would be called Shin Godzilla. Shin in Japanese meaning new, true, God, and apparently in some cases, evolved. This incarnation of Godzilla would be even taller than the legendary Godzilla, making it the tallest Godzilla to date. This Godzilla was also confirmed to retain suitmation, as had become staple in the Toho Godzilla films. The suit would be enhanced with CGI, to make the monster more animated in terms of movement. This incarnation of Godzilla would be a drastic turn from the original, as the themes of the film were changed to match with the recent natural disasters of Japan, specifically the tsunami and earthquake that devastated Japan only a few years prior. The horrific event of a 9.0 magnitude earthquake, which is the most powerful earthquake Japan has ever faced, that would make a colossal tsunami that led to further destruction. The event would also cause the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, which resulted in a nuclear meltdown that caused radiation to spread throughout the area. While the direct radiation did not cause any casualties, it is believed that an estimated 1,600 deaths occurred because of the poor evacuation, and will continue, due likely to deaths resulting from cancer gained through the radiation. An investigation on the incident found that the accident could have been easily foreseen, and that the plant had not taken basic safety requirements for such an event. The events caused nearly 16,000 casualties, left over 6,000 injured, and left approximately 2.5 thousand people missing. Shin Godzilla in the film serves the purpose of being a metaphor for the three events, by creating very similar damage simply through its presence. The film also presents a commentary on the Japanese government, and, according to some, a satire on Japanese politics. This is because many of the people in the film that are portrayed as government officials are shown being more occupied with superficial things, such as organizing meetings, rather than directly handling the issue. Such issues also were presented with the triple disaster in Japan, where many people frowned upon the decisions made by the Japanese government, making the disaster the most costly in all of history. Godzilla's presence in the film is purely antagonistic, yet at the same time, the people in the film, such as those in the government, showed to be more stifling in people's survival. The film was met with critical acclaim in Japan, and was the second highest grossing film of the year, only second to Your Name, which is currently the fourth highest grossing film of all time in Japan. The film also had a limited theatrical showing in the United States. This was the first time the Toho Godzilla had been shown in American theaters ever since Godzilla 2000. With the film's massive success and open-ended conclusion, it would appear that the film will likely get a sequel. However, co-director Shinji Higuchi confirmed that a sequel for the film cannot be made until 2020, as Toho must wait for Legendary to release its two other films. However, a CG anime Godzilla film, titled Godzilla Monster Planet, is scheduled for release on November 17th of 2017. It is supposedly the first film in a trilogy, and will be released theatrically in Japan, and worldwide on Netflix, after the theatrical release. In conclusion, Godzilla has shown itself to be timeless. The legendary monster has been and continues to be a staple and icon of cinema. It is one of few franchises that has crossed the bridge from simply being a massive monster to becoming a cultural phenomenon. It is a monster that evolves with its time, and cements its legacy with each installment it makes. It started as a metaphor for the nuclear devastation and radiation from the atomic bombs dropped on Japan, and has gone on to birth an entire genre, featuring the likes of other monsters it would battle for countless people's entertainment. It was an action star. It was a role model for kids. It was a cultural divider and a unifier, a symbol for the devastation brought in the earthquake and tsunami in Japan. Godzilla managed to be an embodiment of the spirit of Japan, the hardships, the destruction, the victories, and much more, that has allowed Godzilla to remain just as meaningful as the day it was conceived, and its reign as the king of the monsters will continue to influence people all over the world, as its relevance in pop culture only continues to grow in the minds of moviegoers and in the minds of filmmakers. The name Godzilla does not simply carry the weight of the monster behind it, but it carries the countless names of people that have put their valuable time into the films. It carries the catalyst of imagination that has influenced so many, and it carries the embodiment of a country, the heart and soul of Japan. So what is Godzilla? Godzilla may mean many different things to many different people, but no matter who you ask, no matter when you ask, and no matter what you ask, people will recognize the name of the monster that has struck so many people's hearts and minds.